Well, welcome everyone. Glad that you're part of our class tonight. Thank you for being here, and we hope that all is well with you as the new year begins. We are in the book of James. We're in chapter 3. So if you've got a Bible there in front of you, you can turn to James chapter 3. That's where we're going to pick up with our reading. James writes, "Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they're so large and are driven by strong winds, they're steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our God and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water." James talks.
I really like the imagery that he's. You can, assuming that he wrote it. I mean, he really had a talent for finding vivid language that really makes you understand what he's trying to get at.
And what is he trying to get at? You're absolutely right. It's some of the more memorable images and metaphors in the Bible. What is he trying to say with all these images about the bit in the mouths of the horse, the rudder of the ship, the small spark that sets the great forest on fire? What's he getting at? What's his point?
The importance of our words, of course. And I think he's saying there's always some junk in our heart too, that kind of divides it. So it's hard to be consistent.
Okay.
In fact, it's impossible.
Junk.
Nobody does it. I don't think except Jesus. He's probably the only person that ever had a pure heart 100%, never said something that he should have said.
Jesus pointed out that out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? He pointed out how that it's not really a tongue problem at all, a mouth problem at all. It's a heart problem, which James also will get into as we go on into this chapter. But yeah, he begins by focusing on the tongue as representative of this whole facility that we have of being able to speak. Our minds, our hearts, our voices. The tongue is a piece of that, but is representative of the whole system of speech that human beings have been given and how it can be misused. A small part of the body can cause a lot of damage. I think I stepped on somebody.
I think it's like the power of speech. It's not just one person. It can move a ship. It's lasting. It's got great power that goes beyond what most people would think about when they're saying something. I wonder if he knew how his speech was going to be powerful over the centuries.
As Diana points out, the power of it as we read it, and how that how that even further illustrates what you're saying. That our speech, the things we say, can make a great difference for good or ill in the world. And we can all point to examples of that, right? We can all point to people who had a way with words, who could convince and convict and get things done and change things by the way they spoke. And we've known people who caused great loss and great pain and suffering in the world, also by the things that they said and did. What we forget is that we all have to some degree that same ability and that same power to influence and to cause either good or ill in our world. And that's, I think, the large view of what he's trying to get across. How much the things that we say can cause damage or good in the world.
Patrick,
Yeah,
when I was a kid, I remember learning the little phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. And I think that was to say, if someone teases you, just move on, the words aren't gonna hurt you. But when my kids came through school, the phrase had been changed 180 degrees. And what they learned was, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can forever hurt me, or something like that, or words can hurt forever. And that was more to the person doing the teasing, that you can actually hurt someone. The bones can heal, but the words may hurt forever.
Sure.
And I thought it was a probably more helpful phrase, the newer version. I don't know how other people.
More
learned it.
accurate, I think. I learned it too, and it was kind of a defiant thing. You can't hurt me with things you say, and that's a good thing to remember, perhaps. But I mean, come on, we've all been hurt by words, and we've all hurt people by words, and done so, probably in severe ways at times. So yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think I think words can hurt, and they can hurt lastingly, and really cause hurt for a lifetime over just something said, maybe even not meaning to hurt anybody, or not meaning to be taken so seriously.
Proverbs 2 is a good American lips.
Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, I mean, there's several in
Yeah.
Proverbs 12.
Yeah.
Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue lasts only a moment.
Yeah.
And I think
Proverbs
too-
has a lot to say about the tongue. This is James didn't invent this. Jesus didn't invent this. This is all stuff that comes from the Old Testament. It comes from Proverbs. It comes from the realization that wisdom requires us to be aware of the things we say and how we say it. I think Proverbs is the first in the Bible to compare the tongue to a fire, speech to a fire.
And Patrick, I was going to say that when I read James, especially chapter 3, it makes me think of that I have a responsibility to make sure my speech is measured, that I shouldn't just say the first thing that comes to my mind, or just allow my words to, because I've even teased like family members and close friends, and I think I'm having a good time, and then later I find out that hurt them.
Yeah.
And because I wasn't measured, I wasn't thinking about them, I was just thinking about whatever I wanted to say or be funny or whatever the case is. So I think here it's just all of us are so capable of speech that can hurt other people that we should really work to measure. And that's a lifelong thing for me, is just trying to measure what I say and how I say it, because you could have all the right intent, but it still can land wrong on the other person. And so this is helpful when I read it, that, I need to measure my speech. I
For
need
sure.
to
Yeah.
Watch how I say things.
I was thinking about reading this. I was thinking about and I think I hear it even more often now than I used to. people saying things like, well, I'm just telling you the truth, or well, I'm just speaking the truth. And, if you can't handle that, that's your problem. I suppose there are occasions where that's true, but I think more often it's something we reach for as sort of an excuse for being a jerk when we don't have to be. It's a way of sort of passing the responsibility for what is said to the hearer versus the speaker. And while there's obviously times where that's necessary, I don't want to minimize the responsibility of what comes out of our mouths. We've got to measure, as you put it, we've got to be careful with, we've got to take stock of, because there's no going back sometimes, and there's no putting those words back, and they can cause pain. And theologically, when we curse others, James says that's inconsistent. You can't praise God and curse the people made in His image. That doesn't track. That doesn't work. The people to whom we speak are all people who bear God's image, and we need to take that into account and be aware of that and remember that every time we open our mouths.
I find there's such a conflict. It's conflicting for me when I'm working with people and I feel like they need to speak up. And we talk about being assertive and speaking up and setting boundaries. And then in the same breath, so to speak, with the same person, I find myself, depending on how far we get, talking about being measured and talking about watching how it lands on another person. And if I'm paying attention, then maybe I don't need to say it, because if we know it's going to land a certain way, especially in relationships like spouses or best friends or siblings, you kind of know how each other will respond. And sometimes we need to just, I'm not going to say, so I find myself conflicted, helping people to be assertive, but yet knowing when to pull up. And that's a little bit of the give and take when I read this personally, even, okay, I get to be assertive. I get to say what I need to say. And I think that's, some of the people say, well, if you don't like what I'm saying, then don't be with me. Yeah, well, if they don't like that, then measure yourself and don't let it land in a way that it's causing more conflict than a solution. But it's really difficult to kind of navigate that, but I think it's needed.
It is difficult. It is difficult because you're right. I mean, speech is something that we as human beings that we need. I think it's very difficult as a human being to be voiceless, either literally or figuratively. And I think there are certainly times where you do have to speak up, and you have to speak up sometimes forcefully and determinedly. But I don't think James is necessarily talking about those times here, and he doesn't tell us not to speak. He just is reminding us, I think, of how powerful words can be and what they can do, both positively and negatively. And he says, anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? If you think about that, that's an interesting statement. What does he mean? Why does he believe that? Why does he say that? That anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. Why would he say something?
It takes a lot of discipline to get your words right all the time. So if you can do that, you should be able to discipline your body.
Okay.
It takes a lot of work too. But very few people are that well healed, like I said, except Jesus. They always get it right.
Yeah, he's talking about how difficult this can be, and we've talked about some of the reasons why this can be difficult. But let's talk about some more. Why is it so difficult? I mean, I'm assuming that all of you, at times at least, have found it difficult to measure your speech. That all of you at times have both been on the receiving end and the giving end of bad speech, abusive speech even. I'm sure that most of us can relate to that one way or the other. Why is it so hard? Why do we find it so difficult?
Mouth operating independently.
Well, we say that sometimes, but of course, that, literally, that's not true, but I think what we mean when we say that is sometimes we're not thinking about the things we ought to be considering when we speak, right? That sometimes in the heat of the moment where we want to win an argument or we want to make our point or we want to say what we think needs saying, and we're not thinking sometimes about the people to whom we're speaking and at the very least their status as people who bear God's image. We're not thinking sometimes about the things we ought to be considering, maybe, is what that means. Because it can be hard.
Language is also imprecise.
Yeah.
You know, we might say something meaning one thing and another person takes it very differently from what we intended. And, you know, maybe that idea never crossed our mind that they would take it that way, but it happens all the time.
We hear some of that in public discourse now, right? We talk about, words or language that shouldn't be used, and other people tend to sometimes say, well, they shouldn't be so offended by that, or they shouldn't be upset by that. And as though we can get to be the arbiters of how people take the things we say, and we can't be that. People are gonna take the things we say, how we say it. Sometimes that just requires an honest, I didn't realize, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Josh pointed out this evening, we were talking, he said he doesn't use expressions that he doesn't really know the meaning of, because he says often those turn out to be offensive. And so he which I kind of common sense, but it I think pretty valuable and pretty important that if you're not pretty sure about what something means, maybe you ought to tap the brakes, or how it can be taken, how it can be received. Because it can be difficult. It can be difficult because we don't think clearly about the things we should be thinking about and how we should be thinking. It can be difficult because, as you said, language is imprecise. Language doesn't always communicate what we want. What else? What else makes it difficult for you? I think for me, a lot of times the mistake I make comes when I'm speaking out of a place of heightened emotion. I'm really wrapped up in what I'm saying or what we're talking about, and I can lose track of the value of it. Something I feel strongly about. I can easily wind up hurting people because what I'm thinking about is trying to make the point, trying to get across what I want to get across.
I have a
I
question.
remember also that there were expressions that my parents used, and it was involving maybe another ethnic group and they would use, I could give an example, but I don't want to, because I'm afraid somebody would be offended, but they use those things all the time, and I don't think they thought anything of it, and maybe they didn't, at that time, they didn't get a reaction that a person using that expression today would get. And I try to catch myself if I ever would use an expression like that. And I hope I haven't ever used one that offended someone. But things like that.
Yeah. Good. Christy, were you gonna say something?
I have actually a question. This first part that we're talking about, it almost reads to me like it's in the context of teachers, because the introduction sentence is teachers And then the reference to, being able to guide a horse just by the small bit and the ship just by the small rudder, almost seems to be in the context of if you have a role as a teacher, not necessarily in this spot, later, yes, but in this spot, referring to me more like to those of you who are, teachers and leaders, your language has more power and therefore be careful, as opposed to, when you say something out of anger or, because you think you need to be clear and tell someone the truth. I don't know. I was wondering if anyone else read it that way, that it was, that first part was more like really being careful about teaching and kind of how we do that,
I think certainly that's how he broaches this subject. He wants to talk first to those who are, it seems like maybe almost he's trying to tamp down an enthusiasm for being a teacher, tamp it down in the sense of, do you realize when you're aspiring to do this, do you realize what the expectation is? And I think we all understand that being judged more strictly comes from the idea of if you use words to try to guide people and if you presume to do that, then you better be especially careful, because your words can sometimes be multiplied in effect. Now, I think it's true for everybody to some degree, but certainly the more you presume to lead and guide and instruct, the more careful you've got to be. I think everybody who's ever taught a Bible class or ever preached a sermon or ever, I think we've all sort of recognized that there is an expectation there that we have to be particularly careful.
I think there's a little bit of irony here, perhaps, in that I think he does start talking about the power of a teacher and potentially misguiding or the like. But as I said, sort of ironically, I think the topic gets a little bit away from him, and he starts expanding on it. So by the end, I think we have just sort of a general tirade against the power of the tongue, but it actually, in context, and I don't disagree with any of the examples that people gave. I think, though, in context, this is probably, we've already had this works versus faith. I think James may be relapsing here into a common conception, Greek, other cultures at the time, words versus deeds here. And James is not really big on words. I think in general, and as a matter of fact, I know we haven't gotten to that, but the opening lines of the next passage sort of suggests that may be where he's going, because wisdom is not judged by words, according to James.
Right.
It's judged by deeds, which is really interesting. It really puts it on its head compared to what I think we would normally think. But I think, given what the context we just came from and what James had previously said about faith and works, I think it makes perfect sense in the context of James. He's not big on what people say. He wants them not to just talk the talk. He wants them to walk the walk. So.
I agree. I think, though, he uses word. I think in this section, when he starts speaking here, I think he would consider this the kind of speech he's talking about part of the things that we should do. This is one of the ways that you do the word and not just listen. You feed those who are hungry, you care for those in need, but you also are careful about the way you speak. And I think you're certainly right that he would probably not want us, he doesn't want a bunch of people fighting to be teachers because he doesn't want everybody spouting words and spouting words and spouting words. But I think he would say that the words that we do use, that's part of how we, as you said, show wisdom. It's part of how we do the word that is spoken to us. We measure our words. We use them carefully. We recognize, we respect the power of them, and we try to treat them that way.
I frankly get quite confused by this, to be honest. I get the first part. We need to control what we say, right? It has great power. And then we get the analogies of how powerful it is, and the fires and all the very vivid imagery. And then we're told, well, you can't control your tongue. I mean, I think,
You mean in verse 2?
no, no one can tame the tongue, a restless
oh.
evil full of deadly poison.
Yeah.
And then how can we have, blessing and cursing? I think the idea, my impression is the idea is we can't have blessing and cursing. You need to only be doing blessing, but basically we can bless and curse. We do all the time, right? I mean, we shouldn't is different from we can't. So I think I get the overall lesson, but I frankly am puzzled by, I think I got it. And then but you can't control your tongue. You need to control your tongue. You can't control your tongue. And how could it happen that you can't I'm just overreading this, but
a couple of things come to mind there. One being, no one can tame the tongue. I think that's a way of just, again, emphasizing how difficult this is. None of us is up to this because it is so hard. It is our tongues do get away from us. I think, and maybe that's to Ron's statement that James probably distrusts a lot of words, that because of that we do have a hard time taming our tongues. But think about that word taming. We have a hard time turning our tongues toward the things for which we should be using them for. And I think maybe one of the things that's left out hanging there that he doesn't say, but that maybe we should be considering is this is part of the work of the Spirit in us. This is part of God's work in us. None of us are up to this alone, but as people who have heard this word that James is talking about, we should be, we might still not be perfect in this, we probably won't be, but we should still be trying to do our best to tame our tongues as God helps us to do so. So maybe that helps somewhat. The emphasis is on how difficult this is, how powerful the tongue can be for good and evil, and how, given all that, we need to be especially careful, especially for teachers, especially for people who speak a lot.
I think it's like, was that act in Las Vegas where they had those tigers? I can't remember the name.
Siegfried Roy.
Yeah, and where I don't know if they actually thought that those tigers were tame, but
I think they.
If they thought that they had them under control, they sure were very wrong about that. And I think, anytime you're even a dog, you have to be really careful because sometimes those wild instincts come out and, you don't have any idea when that's gonna happen, but like with children around dogs, you have to be really vigilant. And I think so this is kind of saying, well, yeah, you might think you've tamed your tongue, but don't be complacent
Yeah,
about it.
that's a good,
You
yeah.
always have to be thinking about it and being sure that you're measuring your words carefully.
I mean, right after he talks about that, or after he says that, no human being can tame the tongue, he says, don't believe me? Well, you Christians, we can all praise God and then go right out and curse our fellow human beings. Obviously, our tongues aren't as tame as we think they are, right? Sure, we're there using our tongues, using our power of speech to worship God. And then we go out, and the first time somebody gets us irritated, we lay into and we want to hurt them like they've hurt us. And that shouldn't be. So I think you're right. I think that's a really good metaphor, that idea of how, even wild animals, even tamed animals can still hurt you at times when that untamed streak comes out. Other thoughts?
Well, I think the quickest way to kill your influence is to not have it, tongue under control. Right, here we are, we spend a lot of time preaching to people, trying to set a good example. And one of the best ways we can set a good example and be a good influence is to have a self-controlled tongue. But then when we lose that, then I think we blow our influence.
I think you're right. I think that's
something maybe he's getting at. He doesn't address it directly, but
I think that's one of the most common ways we lose our influence.
yeah,
we
just having a foul mouth, for instance. I've heard Christians that come out with a few words that I was really set back. That person would never use that word, but they did. It was a 4-letter word. Wow.
or speak in a hurtful way,
It
or
really changed my perception of them a little bit. Their Christian character a little bit.
Or speak in a-
Maybe they'll change. You'll get over it.
or speak in a hurtful way, speak in a careless way. I mean, all of those things can cause us to lose the influence that we may have. Good, that's a good point. The inconsistency is what he sort of brings it back to. This you don't get fresh water and salt water from the same spring. You don't get figs from grapevines or olives from fig trees. It's this idea of consistency with the way we speak. In the natural world, you don't see that inconsistency. You don't see that both and. You see one or the other. And for Christians, of course, the one ought to be praise and respect for people as image bearers of God, and care with our words so that we're speaking. Paul talks about speaking words that build up and encourage. I think James would agree with that. So that is where he is with this. And it's absolutely right. Those who have the most opportunity to influence with words are those that have to be most careful about. I think. It strikes me that, we live in a world where so many people can hear the things we say or read the things we write or whatever. It can be, we can have such impact in that way. And
It's a big issue on social media right
Yeah.
now, right? Especially the young people. Some of them are committing suicide because somebody's blasted them, all kinds of bad language and it ruined their reputation.
Yeah.
And they go and do terrible things.
Yeah.
It's a big issue right now in high
absolutely,
schools.
absolutely.
Read
You see the power of it.
They're gonna have to go through all that.
Yeah, that's right. Imagine having to live out living out your teenage years, in view of however many followers you have and whoever else wants to put an eye on your social media. It's tough, and it does illustrate how powerful language can be, whether spoken or written.
I do think that in this passage, one of the reasons why it's puzzling, and it may be implicit beginning in verse 7 and even a little bit before, I don't think we should draw from this the lesson in some instances, like with the blessing and cursing, is to better control your tongue. I mean, that just smacks of hypocrisy. Surely the actual lesson is that we need to be transformed so that we're not even thinking those thoughts to begin with and let God do our work. Because I would rather actually hear somebody honestly cursing than somebody who's deceitfully pretending, to be one thing in one setting and actually underneath is the other. I think that's the danger of the tongue when he talks about how it represents the world of wrongdoing among the parts of our bodies. The tongue can let out what you really are. I don't think he's just talking about the surface of better stay evil, but guard your tongue, lest it come out. And I think actually these two paragraphs also tell us maybe a little bit about the audience that he was reaching out to as well. I don't think he goes on quite a bit here. We can draw some lessons from it, but there probably seems to have been a known issue in this particular group that he was writing to as well, that must explain why he's going on at such length here. Anyway.
Yeah, of course, I think you're right. As Jesus said, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. The tongue here is representative of the whole system of speech that human beings have, from what's in your mind, what's in your heart. All of that contributes to the things we say, right? Nobody thinks the tongue is just wagging without any input from anywhere else. I do think too that sometimes, though, for me at least, when I consciously watch my words and think about the things that I say out loud, it also helps me to consider what's in my heart. I'm not going to say that, that I just thought, well, why did I think that? and so I perhaps one of the things we take from this is as we watch our speech and are careful about what we say, we can also be considering where that all came from, if that was in our hearts. The other thing too is there's a difference between, well, I thought that, but I'm not going to say it because it's not helpful, versus I'm pretending to be something I'm not. I think there's a difference there. I don't know if I said that well, but I don't think it's always hypocrisy to say, this is in my mind, this is in my heart, but I'm not going to say it. I think sometimes that's where we are as human beings, and that's how we respond to situations. And so, is maybe the best we can do at that moment.
I don't disagree that some of it is about being tactful and helpful and the like in your speech. But at some point he gets to the blessing versus cursing, and you can't have salt and fresh water. And I think there he's getting down to more fundamental problems that aren't just tact. It's about showing what your true feelings are and revealing that they're not what they should be. It's a combination, a mishmash of stuff here.
Yeah, because speech comes from all over us, right? It comes from our minds, it comes from our hearts, it comes from the hurt we've received, it comes from whatever, it comes from all of that. And
in Greek, it comes from the bowels too.
It comes from the bowels, right? The guts. It comes from down deep inside. And that's what Jesus was getting at when he said that about how it's out of your.
It sounds like if we pay attention to our words, we can examine ourselves as we grow, as we change, and as we try to imitate who Christ is. The aspiration of becoming more like him. And that's it. If I'm watching my words, like you're saying, oh gosh, I can't say that. Look, that's it. That's really ugly. But then not to just stop there and try to force ourselves to be different and not say it, but to look and say, well, why would I want to think that? And
Right.
how do I make that shift to that not even being a part? And that's kind of what I'm hearing mindset. How do I become this? That I don't, it becomes second nature. And it's a life learning and lifetime process, I'm sure, but that's the work. And that's what's challenging, is to go to the second step and go, where did that come from?
Where did that thing that I didn't say come from, right? You know, and, yeah. I think that's important. I think that's something we all do, whether we think about it or not. That's probably something we all have done before.
Mhm.
We
It's the work.
it causes us, it leads us to think further. And I think, Ron, certainly you're right, as he goes into verse 13 and talks about, as you pointed out, who is wise and understanding among you, let him show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. And that's where he goes in this discussion about doing and not just hearing. He goes from, you know, what you say and what you don't say into, you know, what does wisdom look like? Now we're talking not about what comes out of us, but what's within us, and what does wisdom really look like? And he says it looks like a good life. It looks like deeds done in humility. That's what comes from wisdom. And you can see the difference, right? I mean, one of the reasons that we feel the need to speak often is maybe we're not content with just being quiet and being humble and letting something go by. We've got to speak out. We've got to make our opinion known. And you see how often careless speech can come from an arrogance and a lack of humility and a pride. You see that all the time online. I see it all the time with Christians on Facebook or on social media arguing about something back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and getting irate with one another. And it's like, I'm not sure there's wisdom there. I'm not sure there's much there that's wise.
This may actually reflect a little bit on a very puzzling phrase in Matthew. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a man gluttonous and a winebibber, a friend of publicans and sinners. But wisdom is justified of her children. I think he may be have that same idea. Here's wisdom. Well, let's look at what wisdom produces for children. It should be good works, right? It should demonstrate itself. And that's consistent with Jesus throughout, who talks about judging a tree by its works and various other things.
Yeah, I think this isn't the way we think about wisdom in our world. We tend to think of wisdom as something we know and experience, and you know, and then now everybody's got to come listen to us, and because now we've got the wisdom, we're wise. We think it's something that's brought by age, and it isn't always. We think it's something that's brought by experience, but it's not always brought by experience, and we can all recognize that. James says it comes from, or it shows itself in good life, deeds done in humility. Not in verse 14, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom, NIV has it in quotation marks, that wouldn't have been in the Greek, but the NIV I think is making a point that I think interprets it correctly. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but as earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. And we're talking about now what's in us, right? Is it this wisdom that comes from heaven, or is it envy? Is it ambition? Is it selfishness? Is it wanting to be better than those around you and exceed those around you? It's interesting. A lot of speculation in commentaries and such about what exactly is going on. Some people even see in this that James is writing to Jewish Christians who may have gotten caught up in some of the Jewish zealot behavior and zealot cause and sort of pushing back and rebelling against the Roman Empire. And I mean, I'm not totally convinced, but I see where that idea comes from, because he's certainly pushing back against this sense of wanting power and wanting, bitter envy, selfish ambition, and disorder and every evil practice that comes from that. And as we go on, you'll probably see more that sort of connects with that. Of course, where that ended up was Masada, and where that ended up was dissolution of the Jewish nation largely. But James is invoking instead that we ought to be interested in wisdom. In verse 17, the wisdom that comes from heaven, which is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who show in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. I mean, we could go and look at all these words. Big picture first, I think, is the wisdom that James is talking about is a wisdom that produces something different than arrogance and ambition and envy. It produces peace, and it produces mercy and good fruit and sincerity.
Patrick,
Yeah,
in my translation, that list of descriptions of this wisdom, where you said submissive, says willing to yield.
yeah. I'm looking at another translation here that has accommodating, which I think is an interesting way to.
So we're talking about the wise people of the church, right? This is
Yeah.
church,
Yeah.
this is within church. What does that mean? Willing to yield? To whom? When? That's a little bit puzzling. I mean, it sounds simple on the surface, but I'm not sure in a church context it is so simple. I don't know.
I don't think it's simple in any human context, probably. I think the word carries the idea of I don't have to have my way. I don't have to have everything I want right now. I can and should look to the interests of other people besides myself.
What if I'm right?
And if I'm right, I mean,
That's a tough one. That's
do
really,
we
really hard.
accommodate- We don't accommodate evil in the sense of, oh, well, okay, I just have your way. There are certainly times when we have to the Bible talks about having to stand against something that's wrong. I mean, I don't think any of this is the way it always. I don't think accommodating or willing to yield means that in every circumstance you just give up to whoever is there. How do you parent in a way that is accommodating? How do you live with your spouse in a way that's accommodating? In a healthy relationship, it doesn't mean, or a friendship even, in a healthy relationship, it doesn't mean one person walks all over the other, right? Paul tells wives to submit to their husbands, same word, I think. But he also tells husbands to love their wives, to give themselves up for their wives. It tells everybody to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So I don't think it's supposed to be one-sided. I don't think it's supposed to be as simple as, I give in every time.
Supposed to be mutual submission.
Yeah, mutual
Yeah,
submission.
so what does that mean in a church?
From a class
What does
we
that
had.
mean in a
I
church?
think, I'm not sure you can say, here's what it means in a church. I think it's, here's what it means in a particular circumstance.
Well, we have to live with each other
Yeah,
and we have to respect the fact that we can be wise and another person can be wise and they can come to a different point of view on issue number X, right? Or issue, 1, 2, or 3. And sometimes we back off and say, I would interpret that differently, but I can see in this case why we need to be willing to yield. I think it's an interesting thing to say, not in a context of a marriage or one Christian to another, but in the context of the wise people of the church. I think it's an interesting phrase, and I'll leave it at that.
I think you're right, and I think this is the ethic that's laid on all of us. Jesus talked about serving one another. I mean, one of the ways that we are willing to yield is we serve each other, we care for each other. If I disagree with someone, if in a church leaders make a decision that somebody doesn't agree with, well, how do we make that decision? How does that decision get made? How does that get implemented? Is it implemented in a way that runs roughshod over everybody who thinks differently, or is it implemented in a way that in which we make an extra effort to care for those who see it differently and who, one of the things that we tend as human beings to do is shut out the people who think differently from us. And I think of being willing to yield requires us to be open to those people who think differently and be willing to hear and listen and respond. It's really hard for me to say, here's how it's going to always look, because I think it's going to look different in many circumstances. But I think you're right that we need to think sort of specifically about it. How does it? What forms does it take?
It has me thinking, Chrissy, thank you for bringing this up in the context that you're talking, because I would imagine going back to the beginning of this chapter, those who are teachers. And so when we talk about the church, we're talking about wisdom within the church. And me as a member, if I come to a church leader and say, man, this really offends me, or I really feel badly about this, and I really think I'm right, but the church thinks the leadership thinks they're right, I would hope that there would be a yielding to try to investigate and figure out and talk it through. And maybe there's an impasse, and that's okay. That's the radical acceptance. And especially, I would say, on the church, the leadership of the church, because the maturity is there and the wisdom should be there. I hate using should words, but should be there, that they could try to help the person by listening and trying to acquiesce to some of their requests. That's hard, because I've been in churches and I've said things, and even in Northwest, that I've disagreed with and brought up. And sometimes it's you feel like you're not heard. And so this is very challenging.
Interestingly, Colette, one of the alternate translations in the Net Bible for this is open to persuasion, which implies listening. I just point out here too that we may not know exactly how it's implemented, but we can also probably pretty quickly see when it's not being implemented.
Absolutely.
And I think we've got an awful lot of supposed Christian leaders out there, or trying to lead, particularly in the political sphere, who are not adhering to this at all. None of these words could describe their approach to issues. And maybe that should cause us to question wisdom their wisdom as well. It would be hard to be, and I'm sure this is another topic, to be a Christian politician with an agenda, right? Especially in today's environment, in how you somehow are expected to be a bulldog and, just go after your opponents, which is not seemingly what James is recommending here.
And I would argue that open to persuasion is not exactly the same as listening. It includes listening. But, and so I don't know which is the more accurate, but it's not exactly the same, but.
Well, what I'd like to do, I think, is pick up here next week, because I think this is an interesting discussion and one worth having further. Just because it's 8:30 doesn't mean we have to shut it off. So let's pick this up next week and let's talk about it. What does this look like? And we'll look at all these things and not just the submissive part of it. Let's look at purity and loving peace. Boy, sometimes we don't love peace. Being considerate, being merciful, being impartial and sincere. We'll talk about all those things, but particularly the question Christy posed about submission. What does submissiveness look like? Is I think a good one, and one we can talk about. So bring your thoughts, think on that over the next week, and bring that back next Wednesday, and you guys can answer that question for us. So.